In the quiet suburbs of Greystone Acres, each winding street looked as though it had been lifted from a postcard. Neat lawns, symmetrical flower beds, and pristine sidewalks. At a glance, everything gleamed with the affluence of a homeowners association that prided itself on immaculate order. Yet beneath that immaculate veneer, tension simmered. The tension had a name, Marjorie Redwood, though she detested her given name and insisted everyone call her Karen. She was the newly appointed vice president of the local HOA board, a position she used to monitor every aspect of neighborhood life. Rumor had it that she got the name Karen while scolding a local barista who'd added 3 shots of espresso to her latte instead of 2. Somehow, the nickname stuck, and in time, she adopted it as a badge of honor. Karen was in her early 50s with meticulously styled blonde hair, sharp cheekbones, and eyes that constantly scanned for infractions. She carried herself with a tense posture, as if always prepared to charge into conflict. She had moved to Greystone Acres 8 years prior, after her second divorce, searching for a place where she could finally feel in control, and control the neighborhood she did. The Redwood house was at the corner of Maple Vale Drive, backed by a wide hedge that Karen kept trimmed with geometric precision. Any stray leaf was promptly snipped, bagged, and disposed of. She relished showing off the crisp squares of her shrubs, the shining white columns on her front porch, and the swirling designs of her wrought iron fence. In her mind, these small forms of perfection demonstrated her unerring commitment to order, to discipline, and to the unspoken rules that she believed should govern the neighborhood. Karen's power within the HOA board was bolstered by a handful of acquaintances who quietly followed her lead, some out of genuine admiration, others out of fear of crossing her. She brought baked goods to every meeting, distributed guidelines with an overbearing smile, and posted reminders in the community newsletter about painting front doors only in approved shades of beige, cream, or taupe. Woe betide the resident who dared choose teal or maroon. Karen would be on their doorstep in a heartbeat, an official complaint form in hand, voice sweet but underlined by a dangerous edge. For the longest time, Karen's meddling had vexed the entire neighborhood, but she had never done anything blatantly cruel or illegal until the Henderson family moved in. They arrived quietly one Sunday afternoon in early spring, their modest moving truck rumbling down Maple Vale Drive. Sarah Henderson stepped onto her new front lawn, brushing dust from her jeans, while her husband, Michael, followed with boxes stacked so high he could barely see over them. Accompanying them was their 8-year-old daughter, Lucy, a bright-eyed child who used a wheelchair. The Hendersons had found their dream home in Greystone Acres. The single-level ranch-style house, with wide hallways and an open floor plan, promised independence for Lucy, who was born with a rare spinal condition. She loved the idea of having a yard to play in, a friendly street to roll along in her wheelchair, and the chance to make new friends. From the moment they stepped out of the car, Lucy's eyes lit up as she surveyed the manicured lawns and tall oak trees swaying in the gentle breeze. Neighbors soon ambled over to introduce themselves. Old Mr. Baines from across the street offered hearty welcomes. The Caldwells next door brought brownies. That evening, local kids flocked around Lucy, curious and kind. She beamed and introduced herself with the fearless enthusiasm so many 8-year-olds have. For a time, it looked like the Hendersons had found a real home, a place that would accept Lucy wholeheartedly. But the next morning, Karen Redwood appeared in their driveway. She didn't knock or ring the doorbell, just materialized with an air of practiced authority. Sarah caught sight of a stern figure scanning the Henderson property. Lucy was inside with Michael, helping unpack a box of books, while Sarah hurried to the porch. "Good morning," Sarah began, smiling. "Can I help you?" "Oh, I'm sure you can," Karen responded crisply. She extended a manicured hand, as if bestowing a favor. Sarah shook it politely. "I'm Marjorie Redwood, though I prefer Karen. I'm vice president of the Greystone Acres Homeowners Association." Sarah studied her, slightly uncertain. "Nice to meet you, Karen. I'm Sarah Henderson." Karen pursed her lips, scanning the half-unpacked boxes near the porch. "I want to make sure you've reviewed the HOA guidelines fully. I noticed your front steps have some scuff marks. Also, are you aware there are regulations for wheelchair ramps if you plan to build one? Of course, we must keep the neighborhood uniform." Though slightly taken aback by Karen's bluntness, Sarah maintained her composure. We'll be sure to comply with any guidelines. Thank you for letting us know. Yes, Lucy, our daughter, does use a wheelchair, so we'll want a ramp at some point. Karen nodded, her eyes narrowing. We do have provisions for those with special needs. However, the design must match the home's exterior aesthetic. I will personally supervise the planning so the ramp isn't an eyesore, you understand? Sarah bristled, but tried to remain polite. Yes, of course. We'll follow the process. Karen gave a tight smile, eyes flickering over a small patch of dirt on the Hendersons' driveway. Good. I'll be in touch. Sarah watched her go, unsettled. That was their introduction to Karen Redwood, and it left the Hendersons on edge. They had heard stories of controlling HOA boards, but they had hoped to meet a kinder soul. Over the next couple of weeks, as the Hendersons settled in, Karen's presence was felt more strongly. She issued small demands about where they could place the garbage bins, how soon in the day the bins needed to be retrieved from the curb, and how certain lawn decorations were frowned upon by the board. Sarah found it strange how quickly Karen latched onto them, as if she sensed a new family might be easier to mold or intimidate. Meanwhile, Lucy couldn't help noticing how Karen's gaze flickered disapprovingly at her wheelchair every time she saw her roll by. Michael, a mild-mannered accountant, tried to keep the peace. We'll do whatever small changes they request, he told Sarah. We don't want trouble right away. Sarah agreed in principle, though she couldn't entirely shake the feeling that Karen was on a mission to quell anything that didn't fit her narrow vision of perfect, uniform suburbia. One afternoon, Lucy sat at the large window that overlooked the backyard. She clapped her hands in excitement. Mom, can we build a ramp here so I can go out and play on the grass? Dad said that side door leads right out to the lawn. Indeed, the side entrance had two small steps, which were a barrier to Lucy's wheelchair. Sarah and Michael had already spoken about building a safe, modest wooden ramp. Karen, however, had other ideas. The moment the Hendersons raised the topic at the next HOA meeting, Karen's face stiffened. She held up an official guideline packet, flipping to a section on exterior structures. Any new construction, including ramps, must pass design approval, she stated. We wouldn't want poorly constructed eyesores. The remarks stung Sarah, who knew they would hire a professional contractor and follow all building codes. Yet Karen's condescending tone was all too clear. Despite Karen's wariness, the Hendersons filed the formal request. The plan was for a small, tasteful wooden ramp with a gentle slope and safety rails, matching the color of their home's exterior. After weeks of back and forth, the HOA board voted to approve the design. Karen let out a long sigh of exasperation during that meeting, but could not convince enough board members to stand in her way. Some neighbors were happy to override Karen's negativity. After all, providing accessibility for Lucy was the decent thing to do. Construction began soon after, and Lucy excitedly watched from the window as contractors built the ramp. Seeing it completed, Lucy squealed with delight. She rolled onto it and out into the yard, the wind in her hair, giggling as she watched birds flutter overhead. That should have been the end of the matter. But in Karen's eyes, the ramp was more than a structure. It was an affront to her sense of control. She grumbled to her cronies on the HOA board, pointing to random details. Those railings don't match the fencing, or that wood stain is too light for our neighborhood palette. She filed repeated complaints, but the ramp was well within compliance. Sarah and Michael had the official approval documents on hand, and they refused to budge. From that point on, Karen escalated her meddling. She began dropping by the Hendersons unannounced, always with a new reason to fuss. One morning, she complained the ramp was far too wide. Another afternoon, she ranted about how it was unattractive from the curb. She even took surreptitious photos from her phone. The Hendersons suspected she was trying to dredge up more rules to challenge the ramp's legitimacy, but none of her efforts stuck. The board had given its blessing. Lucy, blissfully unaware of the fine details of HOA politics, simply adored her ramp. She would roll outside in the early morning sun to read books or wave at squirrels scampering through the yard. She played with the neighborhood children, who had become her new best friends. Life should have been idyllic, but Sarah and Michael couldn't ignore how Karen's disapproving glare lingered over their family. Nor could they miss how Karen seemed particularly agitated whenever Lucy's wheelchair was in view. Time passed, and tensions throughout the neighborhood began to crystallize. Karen's controlling nature extended beyond the Hendersons. She scolded children for riding bikes after 9 o'clock at night, demanded that cars not park along the curb if they had a single scratch or dent, and once went so far as to measure the length of grass in front lawns, leaving warnings for those whose lawns were half an inch too tall. "She's gone mad with power," said old Mr. Baines one afternoon, shaking his head. "The HOA used to be about keeping the neighborhood nice. Now it's become Karen's personal dictatorship." Even so, the Hendersons hadn't expected she would target Lucy's wheelchair ramp in a more extreme way. Not until one scorching August afternoon. Sarah had gone to run errands while Lucy stayed with Michael, who was engrossed in finishing a spreadsheet for work. Lucy, bored indoors, decided to go outside for some fresh air. As she tried to open the side door, she realized the latch was stuck. The door jammed slightly, something that had been happening off and on. Michael promised he would fix it as soon as he finished his urgent work call. "Stay inside just for now," he told Lucy gently, phone pressed to his ear. "I'll be done soon." Lucy pouted a bit, but nodded. She wheeled herself away from the door. Had she been able to step outside, she might have seen the figure creeping up the side of the house. Karen Redwood, armed with a crowbar she'd borrowed from one of her few supporters who believed she was simply doing some HOA repairs. Her mouth pressed into a tight line. Karen sized up the small wooden ramp that had vexed her for months. To her, it was a monstrosity, something that stood for defiance and marred the uniform look she sought. She eyed the corners, the nails hammered into the supports. With a grimace, she slid the crowbar beneath the wooden platform, yanking upwards. Wood splintered under the force. She hesitated only a moment, as if reconsidering the extreme nature of what she was doing. But her indignation carried her forward. Each time she pried, more boards cracked. Splinters littered the ground. She worked quickly, glancing around every few seconds, wanting to finish before anyone stopped her. Inside, Lucy heard something, a scraping or banging. "Dad, what's that?" she asked. Michael frowned, gently putting his call on hold. "I'm not sure, honey. Stay here." He slipped out the front door, intending to walk around and check. At that exact moment, Mr. Baines and a couple of neighbors appeared at the sidewalk, hearing the commotion of rending wood. They stared, aghast, at Karen Redwood violently dismantling the ramp. Mr. Baines let out a shout. "What do you think you're doing?" Karen whirled around, face red with either guilt or anger. "This ramp," she spat, "is a violation. It was never properly approved. Wheels belong indoors." Her eyes blazed as though personal betrayal stoked them. She gave one more vicious tug. One of the final supports snapped. The ramp collapsed in a tangle of broken boards. Two neighbors sprinted forward, shouting at her to stop. She flinched but held her ground, crowbar in hand, hair frizzed with sweat. This was no accident. It was wanton destruction. Michael hurried to the side yard, eyes going wide as he took in the wreckage. "What the hell?" he roared, disbelieving. Sarah pulled up in the driveway a moment later, her mouth falling open at the sight of Karen, crowbar in hand, next to the shattered remains of Lucy's wooden ramp. Anger flared in Sarah's chest. "Karen, how dare you?" She dashed forward, tears welling up in her eyes. "Lucy needs that ramp to get outside." Karen's hands trembled slightly, though her voice tried to remain steely. "It's not compliant. The board never approved this exact slope. It's a hazard. I'm enforcing the rules." "That's a lie," Mr. Baines shouted, pointing a finger. "She had approval. We all saw the permit." Neighbors gathered, faces aghast. It was an appalling sight. A grown woman, an HOA officer no less, tearing apart a disabled child's lifeline with twisted justifications. Lucy, still indoors, only realized what was happening when she tried to roll to the side door again, hearing the shouting intensify. Her eyes went wide with confusion as she saw the ramp's scattered remains through the window. She felt a knot of fear and sadness in her stomach. Michael was so furious he couldn't speak for a moment. He advanced on Karen as if to yank the crowbar from her hands. Sensing his rage, she took a step back. Sarah physically placed herself between them, trembling with anger, but also worried something violent might happen. It was as though the entire neighborhood was boiling over with pent-up frustration at Karen's tyranny. Only the presence of the other neighbors, plus the shock of it all, held them back from calling the police that second. Karen recognized, belatedly, that she had crossed a line. Her gaze swept from person to person, all outraged. She tossed the crowbar aside. "All of you can't see the bigger picture," she snapped. though her voice wavered. Ramps all over the neighborhood. This is only the beginning. This is about preserving our property values. People don't want to see. Our daughter is in a wheelchair, you monster. Sarah screamed, tears now spilling freely. She needs that ramp. This is discrimination. This is cruelty. Karen's face hardened. She tried to muster the same officious tone that had always served her. It's for the greater good. Wills belong indoors. That contraption was an ugly hazard. You should be thanking me for removing it before someone got hurt. It was such an outrageous statement that half the neighbors erupted into protests. Mr. Baines shouted, I've lived here 30 years, and I've never seen something so heartless. Even the handful of residents who typically supported Karen now backed away, jaws slack with horror, as if realizing they'd never truly known how far she would go. Sarah and Michael stood at the threshold of the side door, rage and sorrow mingling on their faces. You've trapped our daughter inside, Michael said in a voice shaking with fury. Lucy can't even get out to the yard now. What is wrong with you? Karen, sweat beading at her temples, clung to her last scraps of defiance. She can use the front door with your help. There's a step, yes, but if you... She paused, hearing how ludicrous she sounded. Anyway, the board will see that I was right. You'll thank me eventually. Then, in a huff, she pivoted away and stormed off down the street, leaving the Hendersons in a swirl of anguish and disbelief. Silence fell over the yard except for the light rustling of the broken wood. Sarah collapsed to her knees near the shattered ramp. Neighbors hurried to comfort her. Old Mr. Baines stooped down, placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder, and said softly, We'll fix this. Michael gathered Lucy in his arms as soon as she managed to open the side door. She stared at the broken pieces, tears filling her eyes. My ramp, she whispered. The next days were a whirlwind. The local police were contacted, statements taken. Karen claimed, in her official testimony, that she was removing hazardous material as part of her duties under the HOA. She insisted it was all an unfortunate misunderstanding. The Hendersons considered pressing charges. But while the law recognized the destruction, the complexities of private property, HOA guidelines, and Karen's half-truths about an unsafe ramp delayed any immediate legal recourse. Meanwhile, Lucy was effectively stuck indoors unless Michael or Sarah lifted her over the threshold. The family's heartbreak was palpable. Neighbors, outraged on the Hendersons' behalf, organized a small protest in front of Karen's property. They wanted to show solidarity with Lucy. Handwritten signs demanded, We support accessibility, and HOA equals helping our all, not hurting. Karen refused to come outside, letting the protest fizzle in the sweltering heat of August. She posted a message on the HOA bulletin board, doubling down on her stance that the ramp had been dangerously steep. She also threatened to fine the Hendersons for hosting an unapproved gathering on the street. Despite the fury swirling around her, Karen seemed unrepentant. Sarah and Michael, meanwhile, weighed their options. Should they move to a more welcoming neighborhood? Should they fight Karen tooth and nail in court? Their hearts broke each time Lucy asked if they could rebuild her ramp. The family had limited funds. The destroyed ramp had already cost them a fair sum. Yet the neighbors refused to abandon them in this crisis. Offers of help flooded in. A group of local tradespeople, including old Mr. Baines' nephew who was a retired contractor, offered to build a new ramp for free. Another neighbor, Elena, suggested using a sturdier metal design with foldable sections so Lucy could have even more freedom. A GoFundMe page began circulating among residents, raising money for materials. The Hendersons, overwhelmed by the kindness, realized they were not alone. Working late into the evening, volunteers gathered around the Hendersons' home. Michael grilled hot dogs to keep morale high. Elena brought iced tea. Others pitched in with hand tools, measuring tape, and architectural plans. They planned for a foldable aluminum ramp with secure railings, a design that would surpass every safety requirement in the book. Best of all, it could be locked into place on the concrete pad outside the side door, making it both portable and secure from vandalism. During this time, the rest of the HOA board, finally acknowledging the scale of Karen's misdeed, decided to review the Hendersons' new ramp proposal. The board president, a mild and somewhat timid man named Robert Leland, appeared on the Hendersons' front porch, wringing his hands apologetically. I'm so sorry about all this, he stuttered. I didn't realize Ms. Redwood would take such drastic measures. We, the board, certainly never approved the destruction of your ramp. We'd like to expedite your permit for the new one. Sarah, still angry but relieved at the gesture, said, all we want is for Lucy to have proper access. This is her home too. Robert nodded vigorously. Of course, of course. We're going to declare your new ramp fully compliant. We want to do everything we can to rectify this. He left a set of stamped, official HOA documents confirming that the Hendersons could build the new ramp, no further obstacles required. With that piece of paper in hand, the volunteers wasted no time. Over the next week, they worked with unstoppable resolve. Lucy, though still shaken by the destruction of her wooden ramp, found hope in the bustle of her neighbors. She sat by the side door, peering out the window, waving to the volunteers who hammered, drilled, and carefully assembled the metal framework. Sparks from welding flew in the summer heat, the smell of molten metal drifting across the yard. Lucy marveled at the dedication of those who barely knew her before that month, yet now showed an outpouring of support beyond anything she had expected. Karen, meanwhile, sulked behind her drawn curtains. Occasionally, she peeked out, noticing the rapid progress. She posted rants on the HOA's digital forum, complaining about noisy construction and metal structures that ruin the neighborhood's aesthetic. But this time, no one rallied to her side. The entire neighborhood had grown tired of her bullying. To everyone else, it was clear Lucy needed that ramp, and that Karen's sabotage had gone far beyond the pale. The board took steps to suspend Karen's privileges as vice president, pending a formal review. Rumors circulated that they wanted to remove her from the board altogether. When the final day of construction arrived, a celebratory mood swept the Hendersons' yard. Sarah and Michael stepped out to inspect the newly installed ramp. It was a gleaming aluminum structure, foldable and locked securely with a mechanism hidden along the side. Sturdy railings offered extra safety. More importantly, it was beyond Karen's destructive reach. The volunteers had placed a high-tech locking system that, when engaged, would require a passcode to disassemble or remove it from the threshold. If Karen had any ideas about repeating her ramp-tearing spree, she would find a nearly indestructible obstacle. As the evening sun cast a warm glow on Greystone Acres, Lucy got her first chance to roll onto the new ramp. Michael unlocked it, carefully lowering the foldable section. Lucy's eyes shone as she rolled onto the platform, smooth as could be, and then down onto the grass. The crowd of neighbors broke into applause. Lucy beamed, a wide grin stretching across her face, the heartbreak of the past few weeks momentarily forgotten in the thrill of once again moving freely outdoors. The next day, the HOA board gathered for an emergency meeting. Residents lined the hall, determined to see justice served. Karen arrived, chin held high despite the scowls aimed her way. She wore a tailored blazer, trying to maintain an aura of authority. Yet it was clear she was on shaky ground. Board President Robert Leland called the meeting to order. After a preamble about recent disturbing events, he invited Sarah and Michael Henderson to speak. Sarah, still visibly upset, recounted the day Karen destroyed Lucy's ramp. She displayed pictures of the aftermath. The hush that fell over the room was punctuated only by angry whispers whenever Sarah described Karen's words about wheels belonging indoors. Lucy herself was too anxious to attend, but she had sent along a simple, handwritten note that read, "I just want to go outside and play. Why won't you let me?" The note brought many to tears. Karen spoke in her own defense, repeating her claims that the ramp was unauthorized and dangerous. But several board members, brandishing official paperwork, proved otherwise. The ramp had been given approval. Everything had been above board. Karen's defense crumbled as emails were read aloud showing how she had tried to manipulate or intimidate some of the other HOA members before the incident. She continued to protest that her only intent was to safeguard neighborhood standards, but the hollow excuses rang false in the face of Lucy's plight. In the end, the board voted unanimously to remove Karen from her post as vice president. They also barred her from holding any future leadership position within the HOA. Some residents demanded she be expelled from the neighborhood altogether, though that was a more complicated matter. Karen legally owned her home. The Hendersons, for their part, were just relieved she would no longer wield the power to harass them or sabotage Lucy's needs. Once the meeting adjourned, Karen pushed through the crowd, ignoring the glares. She muttered about ungrateful people and bias against those who care about property values. Though it was possible she would never change her view, the rest of the neighborhood could at least rest easier knowing she had been stripped of her HOA authority. The next week, Lucy happily rolled around the yard on her wheelchair, exploring each patch of grass, sometimes reading on her portable ramp in the sun. Sarah and Michael noticed a striking change in the neighborhood's atmosphere. People smiled more readily, children played outside for longer stretches of time, and the air felt lighter. Karen still lived at the corner of Maple Vale Drive, but her presence no longer lurked over every small decision. In many ways, her sabotage had backfired. Not only did she fail to rid the neighborhood of the Hendersons' ramp, she brought the entire community together in a show of compassion and solidarity. Word spread of Karen's downfall. A local news station even ran a short segment about a vindictive HOA official who destroyed a disabled child's ramp, highlighting the remarkable support that followed. It painted Greystone Acres in a positive light. Despite Karen's cruelty, it was a place where neighbors united to rebuild and protect one another. Donations continued to pour in for Lucy's needs. The Hendersons received enough funds to outfit a second ramp at the front door if they ever wanted to. Over the following weeks, Lucy's confidence soared. She invited friends over more often, especially on weekends, so they could run around the yard playing games. Sometimes Lucy sat on the ramp, giggling with 2 or 3 other kids perched next to her. They'd blow soap bubbles or doodle with sidewalk chalk, letting their imaginations run free. For them, the ramp wasn't just a structure. It was a beacon of inclusivity, a place where Lucy could join in easily, a spot that represented the neighborhood's commitment to caring about all residents. Karen, although stripped of her HOA power, still roamed the neighborhood. Some folks reported hearing her grumble about metal contraptions or noticing her glare whenever she walked past Lucy playing with her friends. But every time, neighbors would pointedly turn their backs on Karen or politely close their doors. She found her old alliances had vanished. The quiet condemnation she received from the community was as strong as any formal punishment. In some ways, this isolation was the price she paid for her grievous act. Meanwhile, the Hendersons found their social circle widening. Mr. Baines became a regular visitor, bringing vegetables from his garden and telling old stories. Elena and her husband occasionally joined them for cookouts, while other neighbors stopped by with small gifts for Lucy, a new coloring book, a jigsaw puzzle. For every hateful act Karen had shown, the neighborhood responded with a gesture of kindness. Lucy's radiant joy became emblematic of a new spirit in Greystone Acres, one of acceptance, decency, and mutual support. A month later, a brand new sign appeared at the entrance to the subdivision. It read, "Welcome to Greystone Acres, a community that cares." Sarah and Michael learned that the board members had chipped in for the sign. Though overshadowed by tree branches, it served as a quiet statement that Greystone Acres was moving in a more inclusive direction. The sign was unassuming, white letters on a deep blue background, but to Lucy it shone brightly as a promise that she belonged here. She never had to feel confined indoors again. Karen's final attempt at retaliation came in the form of a lawsuit. She claimed the new aluminum ramp was built without proper aesthetic review. Her complaint was tossed out almost immediately, given that the board had unanimously approved the design and it met federal ADA standards, which overrode petty HOA design rules. Karen couldn't muster any supporting witnesses. Even the 1 or 2 neighbors who occasionally nodded at her claims had long since distanced themselves from her. Empty-handed, Karen retreated further into her lonely fortress of a home. One late afternoon, Lucy saw Karen pass by on the sidewalk. She waved timidly from the yard. Karen paused, looked away, and walked on. Lucy felt a pang of sadness, even for someone who had wronged her so deeply. She asked her mother later, "Does Karen hate me?" Sarah gently touched her shoulder. "I don't know if she truly hates you, sweetie," she said. "Sometimes people get so wrapped up in their own rules that they forget to show kindness." Lucy pondered that for a moment, then nodded, as though storing that wisdom for the future. Over time, the Hendersons' life settled into a steady routine. Lucy thrived at her new school, made plenty of friends, and never hesitated to roll down the ramp on sunny days to water her flower bed or set up a craft station in the yard. The aluminum ramp itself became a local symbol, Neighbors pointed to it with pride whenever they discussed how the community overcame adversity. Sarah and Michael would occasionally see newcomers moving into the area, and they would greet them kindly, sharing the story, with the generous help of other neighbors, of how Greystone Acres overcame the tyranny of one self-righteous HOA member. Whenever Lucy wanted to bring her wheelchair over the grass into the backyard, she reached for the new locking lever that folded or unfolded the sturdy ramp. It had a satisfying click whenever it latched into place. That little click signified safety, freedom, and the unwavering support of a neighborhood that refused to let cruelty reign. Karen, though still living in the same place, was no longer a threat to that freedom. The crowbar incident, her meltdown at the HOA meeting, and her unsuccessful lawsuit formed a trifecta of shame that she couldn't shake. Occasionally, passers-by said they spotted her storming around her meticulously trimmed hedge, muttering about how things used to be better. Yet no one paid much mind. The spirit of Karen Redwood had lost its dominating power. A few months later, Michael decided to repair the original wooden ramp for a final time, turning its remnants into a small garden bench. He planned to place it in the backyard as a quiet reminder of how a destructive act could be transformed into something good. On the day he pieced it together, Lucy helped him sand the splintered edges. When it was finally smooth, they painted it a calming shade of green. Lucy said, "This color reminds me of hope." Sarah stood in the yard, watching her daughter brush careful strokes of paint over the wood. The sun bathed them in golden light, and for a moment, Sarah felt a surge of gratitude for everything that had happened. Not for the cruelty, of course, but for the way it had revealed the true heart of their community. In that sense, Karen's actions, as terrible as they were, had inadvertently unlocked a deeper bond among the neighbors of Greystone Acres. That evening, once the bench dried, they placed it just off the aluminum ramp's edge. Lucy beamed. She had her ramp, a bench for friends to sit on, and an entire yard to explore. As the dusk settled, fireflies flickered through the trees, and neighbors walking their dogs waved hello. In the distance, a porch light illuminated Karen's silhouette. Sarah couldn't resist a moment of reflection. Could Karen ever realize that her hatred had only brought people closer together? Could she ever see how pointless her cruelty had been? No one truly knew. But Greystone Acres had moved on, forging a new unity that overshadowed Karen's bitterness. Lucy rolled her chair alongside the bench, admiring the fresh coat of green paint. Michael put an arm around Sarah's shoulder, and together they watched Lucy laugh with the neighbors' children who scampered through the yard. The air smelled of honeysuckle, warm from the day's heat, yet cooled by the approach of night. In that moment, everything felt peaceful. Ultimately, Karen Redwood's ramp demolition proved to be her undoing. The device she tried so desperately to banish had returned in a stronger, more durable form. Where once she wielded authority to enforce her narrow vision of suburbia, she now had no voice in the HOA, no supporters to rally, and no real influence on the Hendersons' life. The new ramp, more than just a physical structure, was a statement. It served as a testament to the spirit of neighbors who refused to let petty tyranny win. And for Lucy Henderson, it was a path to sunshine, fresh air, and friendship, a portal to the simple joys that every child deserves. In the years to come, the story of Karen versus the ramp became something of a local legend. Residents told newcomers how the infamous HOA vice president had singled out a little girl in a wheelchair, only to spark a wave of community support that changed the neighborhood for the better. People spoke about the folly of letting one person's obsession with micromanaging overshadow the fundamental values of kindness and accessibility. And for Lucy, the ramp was a constant reminder that even when confronted by cruelty, compassion can rise stronger, turning heartbreak into hope, transforming a broken dream into a shining reality. And so, in a quiet, tree-lined suburb called Greystone Acres, the Henderson family lived with renewed gratitude, forging memories in a place that had finally become what they dreamed, a warm, welcoming home. No matter how many glares Karen might cast from the shadows of her precisely trimmed hedges, she could no longer touch Lucy's freedom or stop her from rolling out to greet each new day with laughter. Indeed, Karen had tried to break that freedom, and instead ended up strengthening it. If she glanced out of her window toward the Hendersons' yard, she would see the unassailable truth. The child who had once been trapped indoors now had a ramp more robust than before, a ramp that no amount of crowbar-wielding aggression could tear away.